Hello, dear all. Welcome. Good morning again to everyone. Hello, Wouter. Hello.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Are you well?
I'm well, thank you, Katie.
Thank you so much for joining us. I would like to welcome everyone from the participants as well. We've got, as you can see, another wonderful professional and experts from the field here with us today, Wouter Schul. So, welcome again. Wouter is the Vice President of Project and Portfolio Management for Sangamo Therapeutics, and he's here to share his case study, biopharma case study on risk management. He's a very passionate individual and expert. When I actually got to know Wouter a little bit, he told me he had so many ideas on what he could talk about, and he kind of decided this is going to be the best, and I cannot wait to hear you talk about it. So please, Wouter, I'm going to give you my word, and everyone keep the comments coming. We're going to be very happy to answer them at the end of Wouter's session. So thank you so much again, and everyone, this is Wouter.
Thank you, Katie. You're always so generous in your introductions. So let me share my screen.
Of course.
And now we can you see the screen?
If I say no, is it gonna make you stressed? No, but we can
Yes.
see it.
Good.
Of course. Thank you so much, Wouter, and please enjoy, everyone.
Right. Thank you, Katie. So today we're going to be talking about risk management in biopharma. I'll also be mentioning Olympic champions, and I'll also be mentioning Bruce Willis. So pay attention to this. So my first slide, I'm diving in immediately into this whole topic of why do we fail, right? If you look at these Olympic champions, we know them all from their great achievements, but also that every now and then something goes wrong on the main stage in the Olympics or on a world championship. And how can that happen? These people are the best of the best. They've reached the highest level for their country to can represent this on an international stage, and still things can go wrong. And the reason, of course, is that they had to take risk. So risk is a really interesting topic. I find this a fascinating topic because on the one hand, we want to avoid risk as much as possible. On the other hand, we have to take risk. And so we have to think very carefully and also work through it very methodically, because we also know there's a lot of emotions involved in risk, and there's a lot of attitudes towards risk. So I hope to touch upon a few of these aspects today, and then have a discussion later on. So why do we take the risk? Of course, it's about risk reward, right? So risk reward means we want a certain reward. We want that gold medal. And if this Olympic gymnast doesn't do the most complicated exercise, which then he or she is sure to not be able to win that medal. You can't play it safe sometimes, and especially in our highly competitive environment, we know that we have to push hard, and we have to get that rewards, to be first to market, best in class, whatever we want to be, and therefore take risk. So the reward is usually clear, and we all want to be in this area where the reward is high, and preferably, of course, the risk is low, but that's hard to do. So the reward is clear, but how do we now deal with this risk? And like I said, there are different aspects to it, including the emotional part. So let's talk a little bit about what do we really mean by risk. And I went to PMI, and there's a beautiful sentence, and it says an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a negative or positive effect on a project objectives. The positive effect is always jumps out, of course, and I think that's very interesting. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I definitely don't want to ignore it. But so that would be maybe before another session. But the negative effect is, of course, what we all think of when we see risk. And that's when I want to dive into this presentation. And so this whole sentence is very well constructed, but I always think to myself, what are we really talking about? And that is, risk is a possibility of failure, right? And that we have to keep that in mind. That is that failure of falling on a skating race or all those things. That is the risk. That is something that can occur. And we have to deal with that possibility. But of course, we want to make sure that we deal with it in a rational way. So we want to divide risks into level. We want to say, okay, we want to have low risk. We don't want to have high risk. So what does that mean? And many here in the portfolio project management area will be familiar with this concept. It comes from the insurance world originally, I believe. And that is that we look at probability versus impact, also known as chance versus effect, also known as likelihood versus consequences. And I'm going to use probability versus impact for this presentation. And we plot then usually the probability versus the impact, right? Everybody's probably has seen this before. If you haven't, then this is a very interesting approach because they are kind of orthogonal to each other. We can look at what is the probability of this failure event, something going wrong. And it can range, I put here 1% to 99%. I didn't put 0% because if the probability is 0%, then it's not a risk. It's just something that is not going to happen, and you don't have to worry about it. On the other hand, I didn't put 100% because if the probability is 100%, it's not a risk. It's basically a certainty, and therefore it doesn't belong in the risk management category. It will go to the issues and challenges. So, and then on the impact axis, this is also very important to consider because an adverse event could happen, but what is the impact if it happens? Something that has a negligible impact can have a high probability, but may still not be that disruptive. And so therefore, this is usually how we look at this. And this is just a schematic. I'll dive into it a little more later on when we go to more specific examples. But as you can probably conceptually understand, if you are in this bottom left corner, either the impact is on the low side and or the probability is on the low side, then we can consider that to be a low risk. So it's kind of like a coordinates on a grid or a multiplication. And then it gets, of course, more interesting if you then go to higher probability events where things could go wrong with somewhat of a higher probability, maybe even up to 99%. But of course, if the impact is negligible, we could still consider it a medium risk. Let's see if I can use my pointer to indicate. So even here, even though the probability may be high, the impact will still be very low. So you could still consider this be not completely irrelevant, but in the medium category. On the other hand, you could also go in the other direction. You could say, okay, the impact starts to become worse and worse, but the probability is very low. I always think of driving a car. There could be devastating effects, but the probability, if you're careful, is still on the very low side. So you would still be in the medium, maybe even low category of risk. So we can deal with it. And then, of course, we get to this big area of the high risk where we want to instinctively stay away from. This is where both the probability starts to become more significant, but also the impact. And actually, if you see that if you're halfway up this scale, you can already land in this area where you could still already start looking at the high risk category, which could sometimes be counterintuitive, and we're going to be looking at that a little bit as well. So by allowing categorizations of risks using probability and impact, it allows teams and companies to focus on the risks that are in the highest or in the medium category, because you don't want to get too bogged down on things that fall in a low risk category. You want to focus on the risks that are the most relevant, which would fall in the high category. I do want to point out there is, of course, also an area where the probability can be very high and also the impact can be very high. And this I call the Bruce Willis area. And I will be talking a little bit more about this because, and I call this the Bruce Willis fallacy. And if you're familiar with his movies, it basically means that sometimes people, projects, or even companies, company leadership, they will acknowledge that there is a high risk, that there is a high probability of failure and a high, maybe even a high impact, but they believe that it will be fine. Because we know, if you've seen the movies, Bruce can jump off one building to the next, hang off a fire hose on the outside, and everything will be fine in the end. So, high risk is good. Take high risk, guys, but at the same time, there's still an expectation that everything will work out in the end. And this is the fallacy that sometimes people fall into, that if you just work hard and if you just do your best, then the risks will kind of be not a big deal. But that is the whole point of doing this risk analysis, because if you are able to actually reduce the probability and the impact, you will actually go to this lower end and you will not be here anymore. So you can't just ignore it and say it will be fine. Right? So let's now look at this is a busy slide, but I'll walk you through it. How do we now at Sangamo Therapeutics deal with this risk management, this way of categorizing and analyzing and mitigating all these and responding to all these risks? So it's loosely based on the PMI best practice. So, and I've simplified it somewhat because the challenge is often that time is a restriction, and also the effort that people are able to put into it. So we work in 4 steps. The first one is risk identification. And it is important that this is in a brainstorming style. Often teams get stuck in focusing on 1 or 2 risks that are very well aware of, that they've been struggling with, that they've already started to put mitigation efforts around. And we want to kind of get beyond that. We want to get beyond that because otherwise we're stuck in a groupthink setting. We are stuck in just talking about the same things over and over, and also to give people an opportunity who may not have had the moment where they can speak up. They never felt that it was the right moment to talk about their concerns and what they perceived as a risk. So we do a brainstorming session. We list all the things that could go wrong. Don't worry about high or low risks or how to mitigate the risk. Just make the list, I say. And so one thing to look out for is the issues. And so like I said, if the probability of an adverse event happening is actually 100%, if it actually already has happened, then it's no longer a risk. It's an issue that the project has to deal with, but it is not a risk anymore. Because if you find that the probability of this happening is 100%, if you ask like, what's the chance of this happening, which happens later on, but you can already do a quick check, then you know that this doesn't belong on the list. But you can also take it off later once you realize this. So once the list is somewhat complete, you don't want to have 100 of these necessarily. I mean, it depends on how much time you want to spend on it. Usually when we have 10 or 15 of these, it's a good moment to shift to the next step, which is risk analysis. So now we go through the list of risks and determine this probability and impact that I mentioned before. So how do you do that? How can you say, this is high probability, medium probability, this is high impact? So, and also, how can we avoid that one project team considers a similar risk very high probability and another project team the same category of risk very low? So we use these standard tables, which allow a harmonized characterization of risk across projects and programs. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. After that, we have the risk categorizations ready. So every risk has a probability and an impact. We put them on this matrix that looks like the graph I just showed you. And then we go to risk responses. And I will show you also an example of that. So if you're familiar with risk response, there are different kinds of ways you can respond to a risk. You can try to avoid it, you can try to mitigate it, you can try to transfer, or sometimes you just have to accept. We'll talk a little bit more about those different options. And also we'll talk a little about contingency planning, which can sometimes be a little confusing because it sounds a little bit like risk response mitigation, but there are some differences. Usually an exercise like this with a project team takes about 1.5 to 2 hours. That's usually how much people can can afford to spend on it. But if you can, of course, especially if it's the first time you're doing it with a team and it's a big team and there's more than 10 risks, then you can spend half a day on it easily. I do also often recommend to have a facilitator or moderator, somebody who's familiar with all these concepts, especially for the first time, to walk people through it, take them through the steps and guide the process along. After a while, teams can do it themselves when they are updating. So let's look a little bit at this for a moment, at this risk analysis step. So we have our list of ideas, the different risks that we have identified, and now we want to categorize them. We want to do the analysis. What's the probability and the impact? This is just an example. So when it comes to probability, we use 5 categories from very high, high, medium, low to very low. You can do 10 categories. I find it a little bit too much. Some people use 3 categories, like the Goldilocks. I find that a little bit too few. So 5 usually works very nicely. And you can, for example, in our case, when it comes to probability, depending on what kind of information we have around a risk, we can make an assessment of what's the probability of this adverse event, this failure to happen. If you actually have numerical data, you could use frequency. If an assay fails 1 out of 2 to 3 times, you can say this is a high, very high probability of failure. And on the other hand, if you know that a certain cloning only goes wrong 1 out of 100 times, you can say it has a very low probability. But often you don't have those numerical assessment or background data. So then you can use what I call occurrence. How often does this kind of thing happen? So here the facilitator can really help the team. It says, oh, this happens weekly. Oh, this happens less than once a year. Oh, this happens a few times a year. So you can also categorize it here. It doesn't necessarily matter really how you put these numbers. You can change them. The essence is that there's something to hold on to, something that calibrates it across all the different projects, and for the teams to kind of have, and also within the risk list, risk register of the team, so that there's like an internal standard of run risk against the others. The one we end up usually using most is just a generic feeling. Does it happen often? It's a real possibility. It may happen. It's possible. And it's unlikely or a surprise. If it never happens again, it's not a risk. So you may feel like that is very subjective, but sometimes that's really the only thing you have. And the team actually like this usually, to use some kind of, it's possible, but but I really, it's not really a real possibility. It may happen is, definitely feels higher than possible. So I'll completely concede that this is very subjective, but it actually works quite nicely often, especially again with a facilitator. Then impact, this is a little easier because you can put some numbers on there. But we can either look at what would be the delay, what would be the cost impact, and then also sometimes in another category, usually cost and delay are used. It's also important to point out that you always want to pick the highest one. So if the delay is only a week, but the impact is 500,000, then you pick the category that is the highest. So it wouldn't be a low impact, that would be a high impact, right? So now we have our list of risks, and each risk has a probability of happening and an impact of happening. So this is an example of step 1 and 2. So we have 3 risks identified. One has a medium probability according to the list. If you wonder, like, what does that mean again? Medium means it may happen these kind of failures may happen a few times a year. But the impact would be very high if it happens. So that's very important to realize that. So even though it may happen a few times a year, the impact would be very high. On the other hand, this risk number 2, the probability is very low, but if it does happen, the impact is high. This is the driving your car kind of situation. And then sometimes the probability is high, but the impact is low. So how do you deal with this, right? So now you have all these categorizations. So that's now where we go back to the matrix plot, and it looks similar to the little graph I showed you with Bruce Willis in the corner. There's an area of low risk, there's an area of medium, and there's an area of high. And so I've plotted the 3 risks. Risk 1 had a medium probability and a very high impact, and therefore it lands into the red, and it lands in the high risk category. You also see, in addition to the categories, also numbers here. This is to help quantify this somewhat. And again, these are arbitrary numbers that we have developed and that kind of seem to work well, because when you multiply this coordinate, you come to a score of 15. It basically conveys the importance of that risk, and it allows you to kind of numerically analyze it. If a score is higher than 6, it goes into, it is a high risk category, it's in the red. Risk 2 was low probability, but the potential impact was high, so it actually falls into medium category. And the other one, risk 3, had a high probability and a low impact, and also ends up, and actually they have the same score in this situation. So now we come to the last step, step 4, and we're going to look at risk response. So here we have the 3 risks. We have the probability and the impact listed. Now we have them categorized. There's one high risk, so we'll look at that one first. Our focus goes to the risk in the high risk category. So what are we going to do with this? So one option. So let's take, for example, the risk of falling off your bicycle. You're gonna go, or you're gonna ride to work on your bicycle, and you're gonna there is a risk that you'll fall off and hurt yourself. So what can we do? So we can avoid. Don't ride your bicycle. Stay home. It sounds kind of lame, but it is actually a possibility. But you could say, like, let's not do this study. Do we really need this study? And it's going to cost money. And what if it goes wrong? It will be a problem. So maybe we don't do it. It's worth considering. Most of the time, you can't afford not to do it. So then we're going to mitigate, right? So accept means there's nothing you can do. In transfer, I'm not going to talk about. It's an interesting concept. Again, it often has to do with bringing somebody from the outside in. But to mitigate your risk, many of you will be familiar with this term. It usually means you either bring down the probability, right? We go back to probability and impact, the probability of the risk going down, or the impact of the risk going down, or both. In this case, if you're worried you're going to fall off your bicycle, you could practice more. That will reduce the probability because you're going to get better at it, and maybe drive it around the block in the neighborhood carefully under more controlled conditions than on the road to work, and you will get more confidence. The probability will go down. Also, you can try to reduce the impact if the risk occurs. You could wear a helmet, which you should do anyway. So you could wear other protection. So, of course, wearing a helmet in this case does not actually reduce the probability. The probability wearing the helmet, unless maybe gives you a little bit more confidence, it will probably not, while reducing, by practicing, if you do fall off, doesn't really reduce the impact. So in this case, the two mitigations are independent of each other and attenuate these two axes, probability and impact, separately. Sometimes it can be both. So if we quickly jump back to the graph here, it basically would mean you would move down in impact, or you would move sideways to probability. So if you can go to a very low probability, you would get out of the red zone, or if you would go down. You can also see that going down in this case, reducing the impact is probably the better direction to go. If we strictly go by the scoring, then so wearing the helmet is definitely the better idea if you had to choose between the two. So the last category I want to touch upon is the contingency plan. So a contingency plan is something that you just basically have at the ready if it does happen, but it actually doesn't necessarily change the risk itself. Sometimes there is somewhat of an effect on the impact, but it's basically just you can't really do anything right now. Wearing a helmet is something you can do right now, today. You can buy that helmet, you can wear it. It will have an effect on the impact. But the contingency plan is really just a plan, something you have the number of your insurance, for example, in your phone or in your back pocket, so that if it does happen, you are ready for the next step, which is maybe call your insurance company and so you deal with it. So it is somewhat separate, and it's always an interesting discussion. I will concede that there is somewhat of an interaction between impact and contingency plan, but I always try to see the contingency plan as something that is really just a plan that you just make and put on the shelf, but within reach, so that you can grab it and that you have thought it through what you're going to do, who you're going to call, who do you need to notify, what is going to be your next step if this risk does become a reality. So you can go risk by risk, and you can work your way through and try to reduce the score for all of them, and you can keep track of that. So what do you end up with? You end up with a risk register. So all these risks and all these mitigations and all these scorings go into a register. You keep it in an easily accessible place so the team can quickly access it. It's really a tool. So it's as a tool for the project team to know where they need to focus, how they can deal with things, and also that they can feel that they have addressed these concerns. It's also an important communication tool for stakeholders about this important aspect of the project, especially to get away from the Bruce Willis fallacy again, like everything will be fine, just keep working. So really to say, no, you have to realize this is what our highest risks, we have mitigations in place, it's still in the high risk category, be aware that means the possibility of failure is there. And unless we do maybe more, so you can ask for maybe more resources to mitigate further. And then review and update regularly. So I want to thank you, and I'm going to stop sharing. I think then I will
You can leave him on. I think people will be happy to see Bruce. Wouter, this was wonderful. I was smiling because Bruce Willis was my high school sweetheart. How did you know? But this was actually very, very incredible. There are so many comments. Everyone wants to ask you things. I'll start off with Joe, if I may. He asks, do you get your contingency plans pre-approved so that you can implement them when the risk is realized? Or do you go back to governance when the risk becomes an issue and request a change to the plan?
So that's an interesting question. So usually it all depends, right? So often, if the contingency plan is of such a level that it will require more resources, more money, a certain commitment, then you would definitely want to discuss that, right? So if that is, and the contingency plan is of course something that you may never need, right? It's something you put on the shelf. But if you do say, if this happens, we definitely want to switch to plan B, for example, a backup, we switch to the backup, then it is definitely something that can be part of a presentation about the project when you go to the governance board and say, we've identified it as a great risk, but it is inherent to the project, we have to accept it, but we have a contingency plan. If this approach fails, we will fall back to this other approach. Do you agree? So, and of course, it's always tough because people don't like to talk about failure too much. It's another very interesting thing, like why are you jinxing it or whatever, but usually leadership does realize, and it also creates a lot of headache because you are asking for money that may or may not be spent, which is also very complicated for a company, right? Because do you now reserve this, earmark this, set it to the side, or do you just kind of just keep an eye on it? So it is a very interesting concept. Usually our contingency plans are a little bit less ambitious, so you can just do it on your own. You don't really need to spend that much money. So it's more like, okay, if we can't work with this CRO, we go to the other CRO, and we're already, we just have identified them. So, and that doesn't require really a governance board. I'll keep my answer short so that others.
Yeah, but short and well covered. So thank you, Joe, for the question. It was wonderful. And thank you, Wouter. I'm going to jump to Cami's question, actually. Cami says, the most important part of the risk assessment is the discussion that takes place. I'd like to hear about the tactics you use to get the team opening up and having a meaningful, objective discussion. So this might be a wholesome question. So if you'd like to answer that.
Yeah, the tactics. So it really goes back to meeting facilitation, right? So it is basic, and it's always good to skill yourself in that and to train. So for this risk management process, we rolled it out in a comprehensive way this year at Sangamo. So I and my colleague Elke, we've both taken all project teams through it with the two of us. And we facilitated it because we wanted to really make sure that it was done in a very consistent way. And so the facilitation is allow enough time, make sure that everybody has a chance to speak and gets. So like I said, there are people maybe introverted, maybe people who feel like it's not their place. They will maybe be quiet, and as a more dominant people who have certain risks really in mind want to dominate. So, and that's why I like the brainstorming step one, because it really allows you to say, okay, Billy, I've heard you. let's go to Jeanette to hear from her what she thinks about the non-clinical safety risks. And so you kind of work your way through it a little, and another yes, and allow enough time so you don't have to shut it down. And also during the risk analysis phase, where we talk about probability and impact, you want to really kind of go back again to those tables as well, to really not have people just go like, this is definitely high risk, absolutely high risk. There's no question about it. You have to really try to help people think, is it really true? Let's look at it. How does this compare to that? And so you have these tools and techniques, and this meeting facilitation, allowing people to speak.
Perfect. Thank you. This was actually, we've got so many questions. Next time I'm going to give you an hour, Wouter.
I'm sorry, I should have left more time.
But please, everyone, we're going to post the questions I said previously to our PPM World Cup platform. There are many coming up from Richard Bainey, from Maitali Dalvi, many others as well. So thank you, everyone. Corky loves your job, like everyone else. And I loved your job. I love that you accepted my invitation to come here and to share your passion with us. It was honestly very, very wonderful and insightful. And I'm very, very glad and honored to be able to collaborate with you like this. So thank you so much, Wouter. It was incredible.
My pleasure. Next time we'll all meet in person.
Yes, please. May, book your tickets for May, and for June, Philadelphia and Basel, we're coming. Thank you so much, Wouter.
Thank you.
you.
Bye.